In this unit, we will be talking about compound and conjunct verbs in South Asian languages. These are two special kinds of verbs which are characteristic features of several South Asian languages. When we talk about verbs, we know that it is one of the central components of a sentence. A verb is also known as the powerhouse in a sentence. The reason why it is known as the powerhouse of a sentence is because it carries most of the information, inflectional information to be precise, namely tense, aspects, number, gender, person, and several other types of information embedded in it. Sometimes they come as morphological markers on the verb when we make a sentence. Therefore, in the making of a sentence, the verb plays a crucial role. To backtrack a little bit, there are two aspects of a sentence. Sentence is the investigative unit in the study of the structure of language, and in particularly in the domain of syntax, because it is at this level in syntax that we get to see the interconnectedness and interplay of several lexical elements and inflectional elements as well, which come into play. And all these things are visible in a complex mathematical algorithm that takes place in human mind. So there are two parts of a sentence. Both are required. A sentence does not exist without either one of the two. One is subject, the other is predicate. What connects the two is agreement and some other inflectional constraints on the two, which puts them together and makes a sentence. As part of the predicate, it is verb that decides whether it will have an object or not. In other words, it is the transitive or intransitive nature of the verb which decides whether a verb in a sentence will allow an object or not. Sometimes verbs allow two objects. In those cases, they are called ditransitive verbs. In other words, they are of ditransitive nature. So there are a lot of things that revolves around verbs in the making of a sentence. As we discussed in the beginning, and as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about two types of verbs. One is compound verbs and the other is conjunct verbs. A lot of scholars have talked about these things in great details. We will in this unit present a very brief review of these two for a quick understanding of this structure. We'll introduce the issue which we are doing. We'll talk about the formatness of compound verb and conjunct verbs. We'll look at some of the semantic factors that are relevant for the understanding of both of them, and then we also look at the combinatorial constructions and restrictions on the well-formatedness of a complex predicate. The syntactic position of compound verbs and conjunct verbs are also important, and that plays a crucial role in our understanding of the verb. So, going back, both compound verbs and conjunct verbs are typical characteristics of South Asian languages in particular. beginning from Chatterjee to Mashika, Subbarao, Dasgupta, and several others have been interested in understanding composition of a complex predicate. Compound verbs are also known as complex predicates. So here is the time to look at a simple description of what we mean by complex predicate, which involves both compound verbs and conjunct verbs. So complex predicate is a cover term for both. There are two parts in both, namely compound verbs and conjunct verbs. We are going to be talking about both of them separately. Let's first look at compound verbs, and then I will get back to conjunct verbs little later in our discussion. So a combination of two verbs together is called compound verb. So in this case, we have story of V1 plus V2, and this becomes compound verb. So we will and we will look at both of them in a moment. So and this is also part of the complex predicate. What happens in this is V1, there is a constraint on this. Not all verbs in any given language can function as V1, and not all verbs can function as V2. In other words, we cannot have a random collection and compose them by putting two verbs next to each other as part of compound verbs. So languages have certain restrictions. There are certain kinds of verbs which become V1, and there is yet a smaller number of verbs which become part of V2. It's called a multi-word construction, and it's a multi-word sequence where the main verb V1 is called main verb and V2 is called a vector verb. Vector verb, which is V2, it performs all the syntactic functions. Namely, it is this verb which is going to host tense, number, gender, and person, that is agreement information on it, aspectual information on it. So it is going to participate in all syntactic operations, but semantically it loses its meaning. So in the entire construction of the compound verb, the total meaning of the verb comes from V1, whereas V2 performs all the syntactic functions. Let's keep in mind, we are talking about compound verbs, we are talking about a sequence of two verbs, but it is this syntactic or morphosyntactic operation which helps us understand and which forces us to believe that despite of the sequence of two, main verb and a vector verb, syntactically it is one unit. And on surface we see two. However, when we see two verbs, when we see a sequence of two verbs, and that is complex predicate, and when we see a simple verb, simple predicate, we see a huge difference in the meaning of the two verbs. Let me give you an example. So when we say "आप घर जाइए" in a language Hindi, it means you please go home. But when we say "आप आ जाइए," there are two verbs in this. Remember, "आ" and "जाइए." It simply means you please come. Then let's take yet another example. We can say "आप आइए." What this sentence also means please come. the other sentence that we discussed, aap aa jaiye, also means please come. However, the sentence aa jaiye is an example of compound verb, is an example of complex predicate. It has a as V1 and jaiye as V2. As you can see, a does not take any marker on it, but jaiye, the verb ja, takes the imperative mode marker on it and it becomes aa jaiye. So aiye and aa jaiye, there is a difference, there is a semantic difference between the two, but it's very hard to put finger on the difference. That is, it's tough to tease out the differences between the two at the level of meaning. However, native speakers of the languages where complex predicates or compound verbs are found would definitely agree that there is a difference between the meaning of a simple predicate and a complex predicate, but it is hard to tease it out. Now, it is this aspect of compound verb which has drawn attention of several scholars to look at what is it that we call a compound verb. So, once again, to summarize, it is a morphologically complex. So, compound verbs are morphologically complex unit. It is called complex predicate because of its two parts. In compound verbs, we have two verbs as two parts of the compound verb. V1, which is known as main verb, V2, which is known as vector verb. However, syntactically, they remain one unit. The literal meaning comes from the main verb and syntactic functions are done by the vector verb. So, let's look at another example from a language like Hindi, which we call type 1 compound verb. So, here is the sentence, हमने सारे तोहफे दे दिए. So, look at this example, दे दिए. So, this is V1 and this is V2. This remains non-inflected, that is, they remains non-inflected, and yet another dena, diye, takes tense, gender and number. Past tense, masculine gender and plural number. So, when you look at this thing, now you see it is V2 which is taking all syntactic elements in and making it a complex morphological unit, and then the meaning of this comes from this verb dena. So it's a type 1 verb where it's one type of the complex predicate where main verb remains in a bare form with a vector verb where the vector verb loses its literal meaning but carries inflection such as tense and agreement. In some Indo-Aryan languages like Hindi and Urdu and Punjabi, we find this category, and I have discussed the example with you. Let's look at another example where we see from Bangla that the main verb takes the conjunctive participle form and the vector verb definitely loses semantic content but takes the inflection and is still tense and person agreement on it. So here is the unit, and this is V1 and this is V2. It is V2 which is taking tense and person agreement on it. So these examples from two different languages of Indo-Aryan family explains what we mean by V1 and V2 and what its composition gives us in the form of compound verb. And with other examples that I have explained, it's so far should be making sense. In some cases, particularly in a language like Bangla, we see that the main verb remains in infinitival form. And again, the V2 takes perfective aspect and third person agreement marker on it. In yet another variety of Bangla, which is spoken in Agartala, a capital city of yet another state, Tripura, where the dominant majority is Bangla speakers, we see some differences. And what we observe is the construction remains the same. It's a sequence of the two verbs. However, the main verb and the vector verb occurs in the main verb and the vector verb occurs in conjunctive participle form, and the second vector verb takes the tense and agreement inflection. So what we see as a unique phenomena in Agartala Bangla is there is a sequence of three verbs and then there are two vector verbs. However, what we still find that the second, that is V2, is taking again the agreement markers. So what we find, and this is a phenomena which is not unique to Bangla alone. It is found in several other languages. One way to put this fact is we have V1, V2 and V3. The other way to put this fact is we do have V1 and V2 only, but V2 again there is yet another complex verb which functions as V2, and that's a very unique phenomena in a language like Hindi too. Now we turn to conjunct verbs, and what we see in conjunct verbs is it's also a multi-word verb. That is, it's a complex predicate. There are two units, but in place of V1 and V2, what we find in this is we have a noun. In place of V1 we have a noun or an adjective or sometimes an adverb, and then we have verb, and it is the verbal part which takes all the syntactic components which appear in morphological forms on them. Now what we see common in both is in a compound verb we have two verbs. In conjunct verbs we do not have two verbs. We have a nominal element, we have a noun or adjective or sometimes adverb plus a verb, and it is this one which will take tense and agreement. Now I do want to draw your attention, though not relevant for the discussion of compound verbs and conjunct verbs, but all the syntactically relevant components, inflectional components, come at the last unit, and this is a significant part of our understanding of syntax of South Asian languages, that all inflectional items are on the periphery towards the end, and they are stacked on the last component. Let's see an example of a conjunct verb from Hindi Urdu. What we see here is an example of noun and adjective sequence, and here we have Sarita ne Mohan par bharosa kiya. This is the example where bharosa is an example of an adjective and kiya is an example of verb. So this becomes a sequence of adjective and a verb. Okay, so we have just looked at as an example of adjective plus verb, which becomes an example of a conjunct verb in Hindi. In Bangla too, when we say a sentence like hurry, which is literally known as make haste, we use fast, taratari as an adjective, and a verb karo, which is a verb. So we see a lot of examples of adjective and verb sequence and noun and a verb sequence in languages in Hindi and Bangla. So the other reason why it is very crucial to understand compound verbs and conjunct verbs in these two languages is because they are very productive patterns in Hindi, and they are very productive patterns in most South Asian languages as well. So if you look at an example of a sequence of noun plus verb, we will find a lot of them, like puja karna, baat karna. And so puja karna, baat karna, shadi karna, dekhbhal karna. There is a huge sequence of verbs which become part of, which are considered as conjunct verbs, and they are normal part of Hindi language. There is also evidence from acquisitional literature that this complex verb, by definition and by nature, it appears to be slightly heavy, is not really heavy for the acquisition at an earlier stage. Children from varieties of languages, Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, Tibeto-Burman and Munda, from all families have been examined, and researchers found that children acquiring these languages have absolutely no difficulty acquiring complex predicate. In fact, in some cases, what's been observed that children acquire complex predicate much before they acquire simple predicates. The least we can say is hard to put the two in order, that is which one is acquired first, but it is clear that acquisition of complex predicate is not really a heavy load on children. Now, when we look at the semantic aspects of vector verb, it is important to mention that it's true that second verb, that is V2, is bleached. That is, it doesn't add much to the meaning of the entire complex. However, it is also not true that it doesn't add any meaning. Remember the example that we discussed right in the beginning. Most of the Hindi speakers would agree, like I mentioned, that there is a difference between आइए and आ जाइए, बैठिए and बैठ जाइए, देखिए and देख लीजिए, पढ़िए और पढ़ लीजिए. There are differences in these two. In some cases, the differences between a simple verb and a compound verb is much clearer. However, in some cases, it is hard to teach it out. So what is important is that semantically speaking, though it is hard, but there are differences, and the vector verbs are not really null. We know that syntactically it is not null, but semantically also it is bleached, but not literally null. It's not that it doesn't add any semantic role, any semantic aspect to the total meaning of the entire complex. Likewise, semantically speaking, there are certain constraints on well-formatedness of these verbs as well. For example, and it is this bleaching and constraints on well-formatedness which helps us understand the construction of compound verbs and complex predicate in a better way, that two verbs where one is the motion verb and the other is a not motion verb cannot be put together. So as you see here on this screen from examples from Bangla, that it will not be possible to put sona, which is to sleep, and a verb to roam together. And this kind of restriction helps us understand the well-formatedness of complex predicate. So, as you see here, this sentence is ungrammatical because it puts sona and roaming together. And this will not be allowed because these two verbs are completely semantically opposite. They indicate opposite semantic. There is yet another constraint where we see, coming from Dasgupta 2009, that this constraint works on the occurrence of the vector verb in the presence of an infinitival complement. And as you can see, that this sentence is ungrammatical because we do see an infinitival element on V1, whereas V2 doesn't have. So the infinitival element on V1 explains the ungrammaticality of this sentence in Bangla. We do have few examples from Dravidian languages like Telugu and Telugu, which indicates V1 and V2 to give you a comprehensive idea of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages. Now, to conclude, what we see as part of the complex predicate, that complex predicate is a cover term used for both compound verbs and conjunct verbs. Compound verbs are sequence of two verbs where we have V1 and V2. V1 is also known as the main verb and V2 is known as vector verb. Large part of the meaning of the compound verb comes from V1, and V2 gets semantically bleached if not totally null. However, V2 performs all syntactic functions, like it hosts all inflectional elements when it is in a sentence. V2 is only bleached. It does add some semantic content to the total construction. Acquisitionally, it is not tough for children to acquire at a very early stage. This helps us understand that though it's a complex predicate in its construction, syntactically it is a verb. In conjunct verbs, we have a noun or an adjective or sometimes an adverb plus a verb, where the meaning comes from both and the verb takes all inflectional elements on it as part of the peripheral features of South Asian languages. In both the cases, what we find is sometimes complex predicates in South Asian languages is little more complex, which is V1 comes as the main verb and V2 can be a complex predicate itself. And with this, I do invite you and want you to look at languages that you speak. Please take few examples from your languages of these types of verbs, both compound verbs and conjunct verbs, and see how complex predicate functions in the languages that you speak. Thank you.